Random House Audio presents Reversible Errors by Scott Turow. Read for you by J.R. Horne. Part 1. Investigation. Chapter 1. April 20th, 2001. Attorney and client. The client, like most clients, said he was innocent. He was scheduled to die in 33 days. Arthur Raven, his lawyer, was determined not to worry. After all, Arthur reasoned, he was not even a volunteer. Instead, he'd been drafted by the federal appellate court to ensure that after 10 years of litigation, no sound arguments remained to save Rommy Gandolph's life. Worrying was not part of the job. He was worried, anyway. "I'm sorry?" asked Pamela Towns, his young associate, from the passenger seat. A gurgle of anguish had escaped Arthur as he had come once again face to face with himself. "Nothing," Arthur said. "I just hate being the designated loser." "Then we shouldn't lose." Pamela, with rosy good looks fit for TV news, flashed a bright coast-to-coast grin. They were far from the city now, doing 80 on cruise control in Arthur's new German sedan. In these parts, the road was so flat and straight he did not even have to touch the wheel. The prairie farmlands raced by, corn stubble and loam, silent and eternal in the wan light of morning. They had left Center City at 7 to beat the traffic. Arthur hoped to hold a brief introductory meeting with their new client, Rommy Gandolph, at the state penitentiary at Rudyard, and to be back at his desk by 2 o'clock, or 3 if he decided to risk asking Pamela to lunch. He remained intensely conscious of the young woman nearby, of the tawny hair falling softly on her shoulders, and of the hand that crept to her thigh every several miles to retract the hiking of her tartan skirt. Eager as he was to please her, Arthur could offer little hope for the case. "At this stage," he said, "under the law, the only thing that could possibly amount to reversible error would be new evidence of actual innocence, and we're not going to find that." "How do you know?" asked Pamela. "How do I know? Because the man confessed to everybody but the Daily Planet. 10 years ago, Gandolph had copped to the police, then gave a handwritten statement to the prosecutor, Muriel Wynn, and finally repeated his admissions on videotape. On each occasion, he had acknowledged he was the person who shot 2 men and a woman and left them in a restaurant food locker in a case still referred to, in the tempered words of the press, as the 4th of July massacre. "Well, he kept saying on the phone he's innocent," said Pamela. "It's possible, isn't it?" For Arthur, who had been a deputy prosecuting attorney before coming to work 7 years ago at O'Grady, Steinberg, Marconi, and Horgan, there was no possibility of that at all. But Pamela, at 25 or 26, had just started practice. Saving an innocent client was the sort of adventure she'd imagined in law school, riding like Joan of Arc toward radiant justice. Instead, she'd settled for a big law firm and $120,000 a year, but why not have everything? Well, you couldn't blame people for their fantasies. God knows Arthur Raven realized that. "Listen to what I found in Rommy's probation record," said Pamela. On July 5th, 1991, he was sentenced to time served for violation of probation. The murders were early on July 4th, so time served would mean he was in jail, wouldn't it? It would mean he was in jail at some point, not necessarily on July 4th. Does his rap sheet show he was in jail on July 4th? No, but it's something to investigate, isn't it? It would have been something to investigate a decade ago, and the records to prove it was nonsense still existed. Yet, even at that, the federal appeals court was likely to grant Gandolph a brief stay of execution, during which Arthur and Pamela would be obliged to scramble in dogged and futile pursuit of this phantom theory. Rankled by the prospect of more wasted time, Arthur nudged the cruise control wand a bit higher and felt some dim satisfaction at the big auto's response. He had purchased the car 2 months ago as a trophy of sorts after he became a full partner at his law firm. It was one of the few luxuries he'd ever permitted himself, but he had barely turned the key when he began to feel he was disrespecting the memory of his father, who had recently passed. A loving man, but one whose eccentricities had included a cramped frugality. And listen to this, Pamela was saying. She had withdrawn Rommy Gandolph's rap sheet from the thick folder on her lap and read out the entries. Gandolph was a thief, an offense. He'd had half a dozen convictions, burglary, theft, possession of stolen property several times. But nothing with a gun, said Pamela. No violence, no female victims. How does he suddenly become a rapist and a murderer? Practice, 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 answered Arthur. From the corner of his eye, he saw Pamela's full mouth turn briefly downward. He was screwing this up, as always. Arthur did not know exactly what he had done wrong with women to leave him single at the age of 38. Appearance was one issue, he realized. He'd had the droop and pallor of middle age since his teens. At law school, he'd had a brief, hurtful marriage to Marja, a Romanian immigrant. After that, for a period, he'd seemed to have neither the inclination or the time to start again. He had given so much to the law, so much fury and passion in every case, so many nights and weekends where he actually felt pleasure in having solitary time to concentrate. And his father's declining health and the question of what would become of his sister Susan had also been draining preoccupations for years. But now, seeking even the faintest sign that Pamela had some interest in him, he felt humbled by his foolishness. His hopes with her were as unlikely as hers for Gandolph. He felt the need to chasten them both. "Look," said Arthur, "our client, Gandolph. Rommy? Not only did Rommy confess early and often, but when he went to trial, his defense was insanity, which requires his lawyer to admit Rommy committed the crime. Then we have 10 more years of appeals and post-conviction petitions and habeas corpus proceedings with 2 different sets of new attorneys, and none of them happens to mention that Rommy is the wrong man, let alone Rommy, who only remembered that he didn't do it when he was about 45 days away from getting the needle. Really, Pamela, do you think he told the lawyers before us he was innocent? Every con knows this game. New lawyers, new story." Arthur smiled, attempting to appear worldly wise, but the truth was he'd never really accommodated himself to criminal defendant shenanigans. Since leaving the prosecuting attorney's office, Arthur had played defense lawyer infrequently, only when one of the firm's corporate clients or its bosses was suspected of some financial manipulation. The law he lived most days as a civil litigator was a tidier, happier law, where both sides fudged and the issues raised were minuscule matters of economic policy. His years as a prosecutor seemed to be a time when he'd been assigned each day to clean out a flooded basement where coliform bacteria and sewer stink rotted almost everything. Someone had said that power corrupted, but the saying applied equally to evil. Evil corrupted. A single twisted act, some piece of gross psychopathology that went beyond the boundaries of what almost anybody else could envision. A father who tossed his infant out a 10th floor window. A former student who forced lie down the throat of a teacher, or someone like Arthur's new client who not only killed but then sodomized one of the corpses. The backflow from such acts polluted everyone who came near, cops, prosecutors, defense lawyers, judges. No one in the face of these horrors reacted with the dispassion the law supposed. There was a single lesson. Things fall apart. Arthur had harbored no desire to return to that realm where chaos was always imminent. In another 15 minutes they had arrived there. Rudyard was a small town like many others of the Middle West. Its core a few dark buildings still smudged with coal soot, and several tin hangars with corrugated plastic roofs that housed various farm services. At the outskirts, a kind of mini-suburbanization was underway, with strip malls and tract homes, the result of the economic security afforded by an unusual anchor industry, the prison. When they turned the corner in a movie-set neighborhood of maple trees and small frame houses, the facility suddenly loomed at the end of the block like a horror flick monster jumping out of a closet, a half-mile continuum of randomly connected yellow brick buildings, notable for the narrowness of the few windows. Those structures in turn surrounded an old stone edifice stout enough to have survived from the Middle Ages. Toward the perimeter lay not only a 10-foot brick wall, but a gravelled moat of projecting stainless steel spikes, and beyond that, a boundary of cyclone fencing, supporting 5-foot spirals of razor wire.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?